Hi, my research topic is the impact of the Court of Justice of the European Union on EU member nations. I apologize in advance for my voice as I've been sick, and I hope you can all hear me okay. My specific research questions are, what are the ways that the Court of Justice of the European Union ensures that the law of the treaties of the EU is observed? And does the Court of Justice impact the policy of EU member nations by prompting policy or other actions through its rulings and recommendations? And how significant is that impact? The European Union website lists the role of the Court of Justice as ensuring EU law is interpreted and applied the same in every country and ensuring countries and EU institutions abide by EU law. You probably remember from class that there are a few ways cases can get before the Court of Justice. Member nations and their national courts can request opinions from the Court of Justice in the format of preliminary rulings. This accounts for most of the activity of the Court of Justice. In 2018, it accounted for 68% of their cases. Decisions made at the preliminary ruling level do become legally binding case law. Individuals, organizations, and the European Commission can also bring infringement proceedings against a nation to the Court of Justice. Often, this follows the path on the right side of the slide. A directive is passed by the EU Parliament. Remember that directives are left to the individual nations to customize how they implement. If a nation fails to implement, the European Commission can open an infringement proceeding with the Court of Justice. In 2018, there were 57 infringement proceedings opened, accounting for about 7% of the court's workload. The court then hears the case and offers a judgment. Since the Treaty of Maastricht and the Treaty of Lisbon, the court has also been able to give financial penalties to member nations for non-compliance, or even award damages to individuals or organizations for harm as the result of non-compliance. There can also be subsequent rounds of proceedings if the nations continue to fail to implement. So the court's job is to interpret the law and ensure it is enacted. There has been significant research into whether the court has wielded that power to actually expand the reach at the EU level over and above the national level. What that sort of activism looks like is the 3 steps referenced here. In judicial activism or judicial impact on policy, the Court of Justice innovates by identifying rights or creating solutions through case law. The claim is that the court interprets EU law expansively to increase supranational power. In recent years, many of the nations have specifically objected to the interpretation of free movement law that gives additional rights to migrants by the court. After the ruling, there is a mobilization for or against the policy changes, and member nations ultimately must adjust their policy and laws based upon the interpretation of the court. Interestingly, studies show that the court is actually pretty careful in the expansiveness of their reach. Member nations can and do submit written observations to the court on active cases, which often include threatening countervailing measures at the EU or national level. Research supports that these observations do have an impact on the court's rulings. Data shows that the court only interprets expansively if the domestic costs of compliance won't be too high and that they consider the nation's prevailing measures. What does perhaps create a sense of judicial activism is the erga omnes effect. Erga omnes means that the ruling of a specific case whether it's a preliminary ruling or an infringement proceeding, applies across the board to all similar situations in all member nations. This has a compounding effect of building upon case law on top of each other over time. In addition, as part of the Treaty of Lisbon, Declaration 17, all member nations agreed that EU law would take precedence over national law. Finally, there is also no means to override the court's rulings with secondary law, or overriding the court's rulings would require a new treaty. The member states are not without ways to resist the court's rulings and influence, though. First, a case has to get to the courts. That means that an individual or organization has to bring a case, which is costly and challenging, or the European Commission has to bring the case to the Court of Justice. The European Commission typically relies on somebody to be a whistleblower and let them know about the infringement. In addition, the European Commission uses their judgment and discretion on whether to take the case to the courts. They are known to not act if the political cost to them would be too high. Once a ruling has been issued, the nations use the stall tactic well. In a study of data from 2003 through 2016, it was found that in almost 50% of infringement cases, the European Commission had to initiate a second round of infringement proceedings to get the member nation to take action. The largest way states resist is through what is called containment. Containment is applying the ruling only to the specific case at hand and ignoring the erga omnes effect. Quite often, it is not even deliberate. The nation may lack the capacity or resources to change policy. The national courts may not even realize there's new case law to consider. No one is actively enforcing the precedents. The nations can and do use containment deliberately on policies that they don't wish to implement as well. Data indicates that containment has expanded since the increased use of qualified majority voting following the Maastricht and Lisbon treaties. As states lost their veto with unanimous voting, they've started to use selective application of rulings to silently object or ignore policies that they oppose. So why do member states resist the rulings? They signed up for the EU and agreed to play the game. The data here is from the 2018 Court of Justice Annual Review Judicial Activity Report. The nation with the most infringement judgments against it was Greece in 2018. Spain has the second most, followed by Poland, Denmark, Portugal, and Italy. Many countries have one or none, though. This data is related to judgments from the court and not specifically resistance to the judgments, but the data is very similar. The research boils down the resistance to three main categories. Powerful states with political clout and economic power are more likely to resist rulings that they disagree with simply because they can. A country like the United Kingdom, who's no longer a part of the EU, of course, or Belgium can afford the monetary costs of sanctions and isn't worried about any reputation loss from non-compliance. Sometimes states resist simply due to capacity. Greece is a good example of that. Excuse me. They either can't afford to cooperate with the rulings or don't have the administrative capacity to deal with it. Finally, different states have different cultural opinions about the legitimacy of courts and the EU in particular. Denmark is a good example of a nation that resists rulings because they are overall resistant to the European Union. I come to the following conclusions in my research. The Court of Justice of the European Union does influence policy of EU member nations, specifically through the erga omnes effect of case law. The impact of case law is tempered by the various ways member nations can resist the Court of Justice rulings, and the use of qualified majority voting has expanded the resistance by member nations, but the addition of financial sanctions in the Treaty of Maastricht and the Treaty of Lisbon have increased overall compliance with court rulings. Thank you.